I've done a lot of videos explaining why I think Frank Turek is a terrible Christian apologist, and I'm not keen, honestly, to do more of those videos. But this morning, Frank Turek posted this tweet, and I felt like I had to say something. So my response is going to be in two parts. In this first part, this video, I want to outline the contemptuousness of his tweet and the cruelty of his tweet, and also the way that he defines virtue and character in this tweet. So, cruelty, contemptuousness, and character. Let's talk about it. So, he begins like this: the people who point out known flaws in Trump's character need time off and counseling because their DEI appointed candidate lost an election. Perhaps they could learn something by Trump's positive example that you don't wilt like a child when difficulty comes your way. So let's stop there. First thing I want to highlight here is the contemptuousness of this tweet by focusing in particular upon the label, quote, DEI appointed candidate that Turek uses with reference to Kamala Harris. If the vice president was a Caucasian male and Joe Biden had stepped down and that other Caucasian male stepped in the gap and was chosen at the Democratic National Convention to become the new presidential candidate, Frank Turek would never call that individual a DEI appointed candidate. But when it's a person who was Attorney General of California, who was a senator, who was the vice president, who now becomes president, then because that person is a woman and is biracial and non-Caucasian, Frank Turek now says they are a DEI appointed candidate. In other words, he marginalizes them despite their extraordinarily impressive resume. This is overt racism, as I see it, dismissing people and sexism. To dismiss a person because they are a biracial woman rather than a Caucasian male by saying they are DEI appointed, marginalizing their extraordinary history of achievement is racist and sexist. And that's the cruelty with which he begins. The next thing I want to highlight here is how the contemptuousness, I'm sorry, that was the contemptuousness. The next thing I want to highlight is the cruelty. So here he says, talks about, oh, you need time off and counseling because your little candidate lost an election. Perhaps you should learn from something rather than wilting like a child. Why don't we consider some of the reasons people are, excuse me, some of the reasons people are concerned? For example, Trump has said he's going to deport up to 10 million quote unquote illegals. Think about this. Think about a dreamer, for example. So somebody who they were brought to the United States, let's say when they were 2 years old, don't have legal status in the United States. They've grown up and they're now, let's say, 30 or 25. The only country they've ever known is the United States. Do you think that that person has a reason to be concerned that Trump is now talking about rounding up to 10, 11 million illegals and putting them into camps and deporting them back to their countries of origin? Let's say this person came from Colombia when they were 2 years old. Now they don't speak Spanish. They don't know the culture. The only culture they've ever known really is the United States. Do you think that person has a reasonable ground to be concerned? What if it's not them? What if they actually were born in the United States, but they're concerned about their parents and their grandparents being deported back to their country of origin? Is the right response to be contemptuous of them and say, you wilt like a child? I can't think of a more cruel, vicious way to talk about the fears of these individuals than this bile that Frank Turek is using here. And you know what? There's a lot of people who are rightly concerned. Just this morning on CNN, I saw a lawyer interviewed, and that lawyer was working back in the over the last 9 years with multiple people in Washington, D.C., including people from the Trump administration and the former Trump administration from 2017 to 21. And many of these people now that Trump has specifically targeted by name, many of this lawyer's clients are concerned because Trump has says he's going after his enemies. That's what he has repeatedly said. He has repeatedly talked about weaponizing the Justice Department, which is what he tried to do with Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr in his first administration. Now he's going to get people that will enable him to do it. He's talked, of course, about being a dictator for a day and so on and on and on. He's talked about rescinding the US Constitution. He talked about that last year, in December of last year. And so the list goes on and on. So this lawyer being interviewed on CNN talks about how he is advising some of his clients who have been specifically named by Trump that Trump will go after them to say, at the inauguration, I recommend that you might want to leave the United States for a period of time and see how he applies lawfare or this targeting of the Justice Department against one's enemies. And then he went on and he talked to the CNN interviewer and says, there's a lot of good evidence that Trump, of course, is also talking about weaponizing the Justice Department against the media and talking about them as the enemy of the people and saying there is a reasonable concern that journalists will start to be arrested by the Trump administration. This is not some flake. This is a lawyer, well-established lawyer who's been working in Washington, D.C. for years. There are many people from that dreamer, that child who grew up in the United States without birthright citizenship, to clients of that lawyer and many other people who have a reasonable ground to be concerned. To mock them by saying you're wilting like a child is just the final insult. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this cruel, vicious, mean tweet is I'm going to skip over the things that Turek says about Trump's trials and come back to that in the next video. Here, I want to just talk about how he redefines Donald Trump as a person of character and virtue. This is extraordinary. I cannot underemphasize, I cannot overemphasize, I should say, how extraordinary this is. So this is what Turek says. He says Trump demonstrated, quote, he demonstrated enormous courage, determination, and work ethic to triumph through it all. Courage is the first of all virtues, because without, you won't do anything else. Whether you agree with Trump on everything or not, our nation would be better off if we emulated at least that virtue. Turek says courage is the first of all virtues, and Trump has courage. Therefore, Trump is a moral exemplar of character for this first and most important of all virtues, according to Frank Turek. This has nothing to do with Christianity. I mean, set aside for a moment what a deplorable character Donald Trump is, right? Habitual liar, a womanizer, an adjudicated sexual abuser, a felon, a criminal in his business dealings, a fraudster, a huckster. He was hawking Bibles in the last few months. I mean, the odiousness of Donald Trump's character is well established. The way that Turek tries to get around that is by redefining what character looks like. To say that character actually is just having courage, which is for him the primary virtue. Mr. Turek, the primary virtue for a Christian is love. Have you not read Paul? The greatest of these is love. If you don't have love, you are a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I want to think of a politician who is most bereft of the character of love, of kindness, of generosity, it is surely Donald Trump. Trump is the very evacuation, paucity, the absence of character. The way that Turek tries to justify supporting Trump is by bastardizing and rejecting Orthodox Christianity that defines character in its foundation with the virtue of love, and instead redefining it with what he calls courage, which to me simply looks like cruelty. And to conclude then, through Turek's own modeling of his contempt and his cruelty toward people he disagrees with, and then his redefinition of character in terms of this understanding of quote unquote courage, he has shown how he is more conformed to the image of Donald Trump than being transformed by the renewing of his mind and conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. And that is why I believe Turek is probably the worst when it comes to contemporary evangelical apologists.